Welcome everyone, Christine here with something a bit different. Over the last 2 weeks I've been writing a fanfiction story for Song of Ice and Fire. There's a link provided in the description of this video, and before watching this video I probably recommend you check it out. What I want to do here with this particular video and maybe other videos to come is talk about this, give some of my thoughts on what my intentions were with the story, how I came to it, how I came to certain decisions. Obviously, I'm not going to say what's going to happen. I do have plans, though. George R. R. Martin made the point that there are planners and there are architects, writers like architects, where they plan everything to the smallest detail, and there are gardeners who, let their story evolve. I'm in between, and George himself is very much a gardener, and I understand what he once said perfectly well with this story, having written 3 chapters for his story. Sometimes characters get away from you because they're tricky bastards, and this is certainly the thing that's happened. So this is a self-insert story of a sort of Tywin Lannister, the Lionheart, I've called it. Self-insert in the sense that you have a situation similar to another story I've read that's not complete, but it's called Charles Dance Saves Westeros. And I was inspired by that, where basically Charles Dance ends up in the body of Tywin Lannister, but Tywin is still there, effectively, in the body, and they, share that body. So it's a similar thing. The guy who I have goes by the name of Richard. He and Tywin end up sharing the same body. They can share control. They can speak in Tywin's mind, basically, and it creates an interesting situation, right? You have Tywin Lannister, one of the most formidable lords of Westeros, but he's a bitter old man who basically has ended up in stagnation. He was a very successful hand of the king for Aerys Targaryen, but Aerys descended into madness and basically ruined Tywin's plan by not marrying Cersei to Rhaegar, by appointing Jaime to the Kingsguard. Tywin's dreams ended in ruin, and he saw one of his best friends, Steffon Baratheon, like Steffon, Tywin, and Aerys, best of friends, when they were younger, fought side by side against the Golden Company in Essos. That's where Barristan Selmy earned his reputation. And when he slew Maelys, who was in command of the Maelys Blackfire, who was in command of the Golden Company at that particular time, and they were fighting side by side in that. Best of friends. He tried to. The way I'm reading it's kind of tragedy. Tywin devoted so much of his life to helping his friend Aerys try and realize his dreams. Ended in ruin because Aerys was not competent enough. Tywin was, but Aerys grew frustrated by Tywin and spurned him as a result. So the dreams, the hopes that Tywin had, as well as his wife, were basically taken from him. His wife died, giving birth to Tyrion. So you have Tywin, basically a bitter man at this point. And then you have Richard, who is very much a person with a modern sense of morality and modern knowledge. And because they're sharing a body and basically they're talking in Tywin's mind effectively, Richard can show him, Earth, or his interpretation, based on what the things he knows. So he can show him our modern technology, the planes, the ships, the skyscrapers, and all that, the cities. And that obviously has a profound impact on Tywin. And Richard is educated as a historian. He understands military history specifically, and he has a specialization as well for a specific time period, and that's obviously going to have an impact as well. So Tywin and Richard. The story starts, chapter 1 is more of a description. Okay, this is the situation in Westeros. This is how it is. This is why the realm is in trouble, because Robert Baratheon ruined the realm's finances. But beyond that, tax revenue went down because Jon Arryn had to cut taxes to appease nobles that fought against them or to reward loyal allies. On top of that, the war had a negative impact on the economy of the Seven Kingdoms, despite the fact that they've been going through the long summer. The combination of the war, the fact you have a new dynasty on the throne, as well as Robert Baratheon's ineptitude as king, all ended up creating the situation. Then you have Cersei and the power plays between the Lannisters, the Arryns, and the Baratheons in King's Landing, of which Robert didn't give a damn about, obviously creating a lot of tension. And then you have Varys and Littlefinger, And there are many fan theories about Varys and Littlefinger. Did they manipulate this entire situation? Did they create this entire situation? Is all of Song of Ice and Fire basically a game of chess between Varys and Littlefinger? Some people could argue that. I don't quite believe it. I think that Varys had the plan, and so did Littlefinger, but I think that they're more reactive than just that. I think like with Varys, it's more of a case that with Aegon, he was basically building a backup plan. I don't really believe the Blackfire theory that Varys is a secret Blackfire. I don't really believe that. I think Aegon might be very well genuine. It's a theory created by the fact, in a sense that George R.R. Martin more or less brought Aegon Targaryen out of nowhere after quite a few things had happened in the books, right? It would make sense, however, with the three heads of the dragon, Rhaegar's prophecy and all that. You have Daenerys, you have Jon Snow, and then you have Aegon, three heads of the dragon. Not quite in the same way that Rhaegar envisioned it, but still, three heads of the dragon. There's all kinds of theories related to Littlefinger, Tyrion, etc. My view is, canonically, Baelish was very much more reactive, and, if Ned Stark had taken the deal Baelish was offering to take control of Joffrey for their own power and influence, he would have stayed true to Ned Stark. But Ned Stark refused, so there you have it. That's how things end up being in Song of Ice and Fire the way they are. And here it's here in the story, in this particular story, Baelish finds out about the royal children, whereas canonically you can argue he didn't know, and found out from Lysa Tully after Jon Arryn finds out. Here he finds out before Jon Arryn, points Jon Arryn in the direction Jon Arryn finds out, and obviously ends up being killed by his wife on Baelish's suggestion. Lysa Arryn ends up poisoning Jon Arryn, which sets off the events of Song of Ice and Fire. It's at this point that Richard comes into play, into Tywin's mind, reveals everything he knows. They have long discussions, and then the Lannisters prepare for war. Tywin, notably here, one of the things I want to do, Tywin is not going to keep Robert Baratheon on the throne of the Seven Kingdoms. Not when he knows what's going to happen, not when he knows exactly how horrible of a king Robert is, not when he knows what Cersei has done, he's going to act. So he allows events to proceed. Though he does do one thing very notably here in Chapter 1. In the first chapter, he goes to the end of the crossroads as Ned Stark and Robert Baratheon are heading towards King's Landing, and intervenes. He prevents the dire wolves, one of them, Nymeria, Arya's direwolf, from being banished by Arya. He prevents Sansa's direwolf lady from being killed. This surprises Cersei, but it makes Ned Stark think, especially when Tywin reveals that he probably knows about the letter that Ned Stark got, which is fairly surprising to Ned Stark, but also implies to Ned Stark that the Lannisters were not responsible for the death of Jon Arryn. Ned Stark doesn't believe it, but it puts a seed of doubt in his mind. But anyway, events take place. Ned Stark eventually ends up confronting Cersei. Before the Iron Throne, Robert dies. Ned Stark is betrayed by Littlefinger, and the Lannisters invade the Riverlands because Tyrion also has been kidnapped. But they invade with a larger and better force. So canonically, you have about 35,000, give or take, Lannister troops invading the Riverlands. Here you have about 44,000 totally. 26,000 under Tywin, 18,000 under Jaime. Jaime had about 15,000 canonically, so it's smaller for Jaime, larger for Tywin. And because Tywin and Richard have been preparing for months for this to take place. And the die is cast, and thus is the end of the first chapter here. It's more of an explanation of, certain things, how I view the universe. A notable thing that's not in this story is the idea of the Maester conspiracy. I believe that people are trying to find justification for the stagnation of Westeros, or how certain things end up being, and also perhaps reading a bit too much into the words of Barbary Dusting to Theon Greyjoy. And she's not exactly unbiased. She loved Brandon Stark, Ned's brother, that is the heir of Winterfell before he was executed by Aerys, or he died trying to save his father, Richard Stark. And and she wanted to marry him, but she blames the Maester of Winterfell at the time for the fact that Brandon was about to marry Catelyn Tully. That's her view. It's a fairly biased one, and she can nurse a grudge. That's one of the things Roose Bolton tells Ramsay, is like she can nurse a grudge, and that Ramsay should be grateful about that, because otherwise he wouldn't have her support. But anyway, that's chapter 1. Chapter 2, conversation, a dialogue between Richard and Tywin, really, where they're talking about it. The way I imagine they are in Tywin's mind is more like they're in a big room, big apartment room, all white. Furniture white, floor white, ceiling white, etc. There's a screen on one side, a big screen that occupies an entire wall, and there's a controller for that screen, and basically whoever uses that controller controls Tywin. They can also visualize things here. They have a discussion. There is a gap that cannot be bridged between them. Richard is still a person of the modern world. Tywin Lannister is still Tywin Lannister, who's very ruthless. And they're discussing how to deal with Robb Stark, whether or not they should try and more or less capture the Northern Army or completely obliterate it. Richard wants to capture it, Tywin wants to destroy it. Richard eventually convinces Tywin with a plan to use Tyrian savages. And then that conversation is obviously taking place sometime in the war, or after the initial part of the war. But then I go to the events that actually lead up to that point. So you have the actual war. First off, events in King's Landing. Because Tywin knows what's going to happen, he sends Kevin to the capital. Kevin waits until Ned Stark confronts Cersei before the Iron Throne, then intervenes with 200 men, basically. He prevents a slaughter and more or less takes control of the capital. He imprisons Ned Stark, he imprisons Arya, he imprisons Sansa, he imprisons their direwolves. The Stark household is not butchered, and that's going to play a fairly significant role in things that are happening. But like the way it is, you don't want to piss off the North, right? You want to give people an option to more or less be able to accept bending the knee to you, and that's obviously what the whole goal is with this, like showing mercy. And this is how the campaign in the Riverlands plays as well. Gregor Clegane does raid the Riverlands before the Lannister armies move in, but he is ordered to not kill the peasants, not butcher the peasantry, which he would do canonically. There are several reasons behind this. One of which, obviously, not leaving grudges, long-lasting grudges within the Riverlands. And another one is food. King's Landing canonically starved or almost starved because food from the Riverlands was cut off because of the Lannisters burning the villages and the farms, slaughtering the peasants, and was cut off from the Reach because House Tyrell ended up supporting Renly Baratheon. Canonically, Tywin was reacting to Tyrion's imprisonment. Here, he's being proactive. He knows what's going to happen. He knows what's going to happen with Renly specifically. He knows what's going to happen with House Tyrell, and he's being proactive about it. He knows he's going to need the food of the Riverlands. He knows he wants someone that's competent in the capital to prevent some of the disasters that would take place. So Kevin takes over, executes effectively Jaina Slint, and replaces him with Sir Jacelyn. As Tyrion did, by the way. Well, though Tyrion sent him to the Night's Watch. Anyway, 44,000 men of House Lannister descend in two armies. And I use the word army here to differentiate between the regular armies, regular hosts that you would see raised in Song of Ice and Fire. So there's not that many more men compared to canon, but they're organized better. They're better prepared, they're better equipped, because there's been months of preparation. Tywin's been gathering junior pyromancers and maesters to Casterly Rock. He's had the smiths at Casterly Rock working on equipment. He has two armies that are organized, and that are organized better than they would be canonically, and that are very well equipped. So 44,000 men in two separate armies, wearing plate and mail, full barding on their horses, thousands of very well-equipped knights and men-at-arms descend on the Riverlands. Now, Jaime ends up having to deal with the bulk of the fighting initially. And this is by design, by the way. Jaime takes Wayfarer's Rest, which is held by House Vance. House Vance has two major holdings, one further to the east in the Riverlands from the Westerland. Jaime takes Wayfarer's Rest, defeats a force of 2,000 Rivermen that are trying to prevent them from entering, and while Tywin goes towards Pink Maiden. Along the way, canonically, and maybe I should have made this clear in the story, but canonically, along the way of this, Tywin would meet the force of Beric Dondarrion and defeat it. But they would escape and end up forming the Brotherhood. Some of them would escape and form the Brotherhood without banners. That doesn't happen here. He does meet the force of Beric Dondarrion, but he knows what would happen if he lets them go, so he captures them. Forest of Myr does revive Lord Beric after he dies, which leaves a fairly big impression on everyone that notices, which is an entire army of 26,000 men from the Westerland, so fairly big impression left because of that. And Tywin invites Forest of Myr and Beric Dondarrion as his guests, so to speak, in his army, which they agree with after some negotiation, some discussion, basically. So anyway, Tywin descends on Pink Maiden. Jaime, however, is ordered to take Riverrun. And this is a reference, by the way, that there's a letter from Tywin to Jaime at the start of this part, where it's like, you were trained by the White Bull and Barristan the Bold, and he learned from Arthur Dane, one of the greatest knights to have ever lived. Basically, this is a reference to a dialogue Jaime is given once he returns to King's Landing in the books. And Tywin is using those words to basically order him to take Riverrun. Because in the actual canonical campaign of the Riverlands, Jaime was able to defeat the forces of House Tully gathered outside of Riverrun, that were massing outside of Riverrun, fairly easily, but he was unable to take Riverrun itself. Ended up in a long siege, which Robb Stark was able to use. Tywin wants to avoid that, so he orders Jaime to take the castle. How does Jaime achieve that? Through a bit of trickery. While the Lancers of the Second Westerlands Army, which is Jaime's army, descend on the massed might of House Tully, about 7,000 men, give or take, Jaime sneaks in about 200 men disguised as refugees, as peasants, into Riverrun. They seize the armory with all the Tully soldiers focused on the fighting. They seize the armory, they equip themselves, and they take the Western Gatehouse, which results in a heavy dose of fighting between the Rivermen and the men of the Westerlands, specifically at that gatehouse. With 200 men, Jaime is fighting outnumbered 3-1, while a battle between thousands of cavalrymen and as well as footmen from the Westerlands are, they're descending on 7,000 or so Rivermen that Edmure Tully is able to assemble. Jaime ends up having to fight both the Tully captain of the guards and the master at arms at the same time. It's a pretty desperate fight, but he survives long enough, his men survive long enough for Lannister cavalrymen, for Lannister knights, for two banners of horse under Westerling and Greenfield to break through and support them. Banner of horse, the way these armies are organized is that horsemen or cavalrymen are organized into banners. Each of those banners is 300 men strong. So two of them, 600 men, break through, save Jaime, save his force, and they keep the way open into Riverrun. Riverrun ends up falling, and Hoster Tully ends up dying from a heart attack, seeing his ancestral home taken. Riverrun was never taken by storm, canonically. Jaime Lannister does it. He manages to defeat 7,000 men, and he has a lesser force of the Lannister armies. He has younger nobles, younger knights. The veteran soldiers are all with Tywin. Tywin's concentrated the best soldiers in his army, but Jaime is the one actually having to do a lot of the initial fighting of the campaign. He does have some veterans in his army, absolutely, but they are far outnumbered by younger men with far less experience. And Jaime proves himself, and the name Kingslayer is spoken with a degree of dread and admiration across the realm for what he's able to do. And obviously the fall of Riverrun. In less than a week, sends shockwaves across the entire realm. Riverrun falls in less than a week after the Lannisters invade the Riverlands, and that results that has a fairly significant impact on the rest of the campaign. The Lannisters move from town to town, castle to castle, village to village. Tywin deliberately restrains his men. He wants the Riverlands intact to use them. So, and he ends up in a situation where swords are drawn because of Gregor Clegane and Armory Lock. He severely punishes his men who don't have the discipline, who get drunk, who loot, who pillage. He draws and hangs them if they get drunk. In particular, I wanted to make that particular point, that he is enforcing strict discipline on his army. And he is also ensuring that his knights and nobles are keeping their men in line as well, because they also have to pay if their men get out of line. Anyway, it seems like the Riverlands will fall fairly easily after that, right? House Tully is defeated beneath the walls of their ancestral home. Jaime takes it, raises the Red Lion, sends letters across the realm declaring his victory, and that obviously has a fairly big impact. Tywin, who's in Pig Maiden by this point, is basically sends his own letters declaring that any Lord of the Riverlands who opposes them after that is not going to be treated as a noble lord, but rather as a bandit to be hanged. So many of them surrender, castle after castle, except for a few fools or very brave men. And those are Bracken and Blackwood, Darry, Root, and Motten. A couple of lords who had tried to gather their men but were unable to reach Riverrun by the time Jaime took it, because he was rushing for it effectively with all of his men. Titus Blackwood, notably in canon, was the man who was able to save several hundred men from the battle outside the walls of Riverrun and retreat them back into the castle, which is what forced Jaime to put that siege up in the first place that Robb Stark was able to abuse. So Blackwood and Bracken really hate each other, so they can't agree on a common course of action. They have several thousand men. They could gather many more and make a stand and make the Lannisters pay in blood, but they can't agree on a common course of action. So my intent here was Bracken goes to Maidenpool, Blackwood heads north to Seaguard, right? That was the idea. But things got a bit out of hand. With Bracken, I said, okay, Bracken with 2,000 men, with Lord Darry, he goes to Maidenpool, where he joins Lord Motten. About 4,000 men hold Maidenpool. That Tywin can't march that far east to deal with Maidenpool, but he can't ignore it, so he detaches 400 of his foot to take Harrenhal, as well as other smaller garrisons of troops throughout the entire Riverlands, the territory they've taken, very small garrisons, as well as 1,000 cavalrymen under the strong Boar, Lyle Krakenhall. He detaches them to keep the men in Maidenpool in check, while Kevin is ordered to try and mobilize the Crownlands against Maidenpool. That ends up failing, by the way, for a variety of reasons, but that's for a future chapter. Suffice to say, Tywin ends up having to deal with 4,000 men, and they end up growing in strength in Maidenpool, while Titus Blackwood ends up gathering 3,500 and he is retreating north. Jaime tries to give chase, but he's unable to reach Blackwood before Blackwood ends up in Oldstones. Now, Oldstones is a ruin of a castle. It was the seat of House Mud, who used to rule the Riverlands. So, fairly defensible position. By this point, Blackwood ends up having 5,000 men because House Mallister of Seaguard ends up supporting him with 1,500 more. So 5,000 men prepared to make their stand in Oldstones. It's a very strong position. It's defensible. Obviously, it's not a castle like Riverrun, but he would make Jaime Lannister bleed. But he had sent messengers to both Seaguard and the twins, begging them for their support. House Mallister had answered, sending them men, but what he really needs to deliver a bloody blow to Jaime Lannister, who's marching his men in a frenzy. His men are getting tired. They're getting exhausted. He needs the support of House Frey. And when all the cards are down on the table, Walder Frey refuses to do a damn thing. infuriating everyone in the Riverlands, infuriating the North, because he basically refuses to support Blackwood at the point when it actually mattered. Old Stones is a defensive position, but there is nothing close to it that would be like it, except Seaguard, which is to the north. So Jaime is kind of in a bad position. He's had to leave men behind. His force has shrunk because he's lost over 600 at fighting at River Run. He's had to leave several hundred more behind. His men are tired, they're exhausted, they're in hostile enemy territory, and Blackwood has 5,000 men in front of him. Blackwood can't win, so he runs away from Old Stones, but if House Frey had supported him, it would have been a very bloody battle on good defensive ground for the River Lords. So House Frey is mocked and despised for their treachery, really. And there's this, and basically there's this account that Jaime is giving to the maesters who are recording this for historical purposes. He basically says it would have been a bloody affair. Either Jaime ends up winning, like from Jaime's perspective, either he ends up winning but losing a lot of men, taking about 9,000 River Lords and basically being forced to halt, or he can end up losing because it's a good defensive position. And so it's called into question whether or not his 16,000 men by this point can actually take it. So 16,000 against 9,000 would have been a fairly close thing because of the defender's advantage, as the way Jaime sees it. But because House Frey refused to get involved, Blackwood has to withdraw to save himself, save his men. And Jaime remarks that Blackwood had led his men in a forced march while Jaime was trying to give chase with his cavalry, and that Jaime had more horse cavalry than Blackwood had men, but Blackwood had been able to outrun him. He had not lost troops due to desertion. He had not faced any serious idea of a mutiny. So Blackwood has Jaime's respect for what he's been able to do. And he basically, and he ends saying that he agrees with his father when he thanked House Frey for refusing to send men to Old Stones because, as Jaime puts it, the weasel handed us the Riverlands. Tywin hears of this. He ends up openly mocking Lord Frey for basically giving the Riverlands to House Lannister, and gives him his honest thanks, in effect infuriating Walder Frey, who promptly declares war on House Lannister, but that's by intent. Tywin doesn't want to deal with sieging the twins. He wants to deal with House Frey, right? So, anyway, you have a situation where Jaime's at Old Stones with 16,000 men, several hundred behind him, but it's a precarious position, right? He can be attacked by, he's facing up to 9,000 Rivermen, or even more than that, from House Frey, from Seaguard as well. And then there's Robb Stark, who's begun to muster his forces, who's called his banners to war, because there's still a letter that's been sent, like certain things like Barristan Selmy being exiled, all that's still taken place, that still happened. And that's, of course, will end up with the battle on the Green Fork, because Robb Stark is still going to march south. And this brings me to Chapter 3. Now, in Chapter 3, Tywin basically forces Robb Stark's hand, effectively, to fight the battle of Tywin's choosing. So, as Robb is moving south, he obviously considers dealing with Jaime, who's encamped at Old Stones, but Jaime's forces are entrenched in Old Stones, so it could be a fairly difficult battle, but they could win. At this point, Robb Stark has 24,000 men, the River Lords have about 9,000. Robb Stark can call upon an army of 32,000 in total, and he can decide what to do with that. He's not going to split his men, though. Tywin is marching north to deal with Robb Stark, to force him to battle, though, and Robb Stark is forced into the battle south of the Twins, about half a day's ride from the Twins, because he doesn't want to risk besieging Jaime when he's got Tywin being able to march up right to the Twins and lay siege them, even if it's just from the East Bank, or maybe be foolish enough to march against Moat Cailin in the Neck. That's a different affair, of course, entirely. Practically impossible given the terrain, given the fortifications of the Neck, but yeah. So, Tywin however, marches with 24,500 men. He's also lost men because, although he hasn't fought any battle, like Jaime's army has fought all the battles, has won all the battles, Tywin's basically been dealing with cleanup, effectively. Though he did butcher the entirety of House Vance after they tried to resist to try and get better terms, just to send a message: if you surrender, you will be spared. If you fight, you will be slain to the last man. He sends that message. Very few others resist the Lannisters except Maidenpool, Seaguard, and the twins for a variety of reasons. Anyway, there's 6,000 men of the River Lords at Maidenpool, so Tywin has to leave even more men to secure his rear. There's about 9,000 or over 9,000 between Seaguard and the twins, and there's 24,000 of Robb Stark. The battle on the Green Fork basically is Robb Stark sending his men, sending his numerically superior army, but in terms of equipment, inferior. Numerically superior, but inferior in other ways, however. And here you can see a sketch I made, or an image I made of how I envisioned the battle. So, Tywin deploys 8,000 men, largely pikemen, in its center with longbows on his side. This is what he did in canon against Roose Bolton under Lord Sarsfield and Prester. Tyrion is given command of the rear guard. Tywin is commanding the rear guard in canonical battle. But anyway, he has to take control of the center because they're facing up to this massive 15,000 men under the command of Titus Blackwood and Roose Bolton. Robb Stark has given command of his center to two of the fiercest, two of the most competent military minds of both the Riverlands and the North. So Titus Blackwood, Roose Bolton. On his left, Tywin sends Gregor Clegane with 3,000 men, an assortment of cavalry and infantry, while on his right he has Sir Adam Marbrand with 5,000 of the best, concentrated force of heavy cavalrymen, heavy lancers, armored swordsmen on mounts, etc. Robb Stark, in contrast, has 6,000 men on his right flank under Richard Karstark. Robb himself has taken the Stark left flank with Sir Bryden, while the rear of the Stark line is given to Lord Glover, Galbert Glover. So what ends up happening here is that Gregor Clegane, the first action of the battle, takes place here on the left. Gregor Clegane charges against Richard Karstark and manages to break through the Karstark shield wall, forces a gap, causes havoc, but he's thrown back by a cavalry charge by Richard Karstark, who pursues. And he pursues it with his infantry, his cavalry, but this is exactly what Tywin has basically planned, because Gregor Clegane, here with his 30,000 men, has a concentrated mass of crossbows, largely crossbows, some spearmen, and about 1,000 horse. So they march straight into that massive crossbow, taking heavy damage from the massed crossbows, as well as the longbows of Lord Sarsfield here, who was able to provide them support. So there's a heavy amount of fighting that's taking place on the Lannister left flank, the Stark right flank. While the center line is also engaging, the masses of pikemen, supported by various missile troops, are engaging in the center. It's a bloody affair. The Lannisters have better equipment and full plate, basically, but in mail, the North has, and Riverlands have, they don't have the same equipment, but they have more numbers and they have more ferocious fighters. But the Lannisters also have a better organized army as well. So, it's a war of attrition. Neither side really gains a decisive advantage. While on the right flank, Sir Adam Marbrand charges against Robb Stark and Bryden Tully, who also charge, of course. Or rather, Robb and Bryden charge against Sir Adam, who meets them in a similar fashion. The Lannister heavy horse is almost able to push through, but because of the superior numbers of Northmen and Rivermen, they have to pull back. Ends up being a battle of attrition as well. Now, after Sir Gregor Clegane on the left flank is thrown back, Tyrion sends Lord Leo Lefford with about 1,000 foot to support them, so to hold the line, and the line holds on the Lannister left flank. While on the right, Tyrion sends Lord Brax with 1,000 horse and 1,000 infantry, 1,000 foot to support Sir Adam. And basically, it's a stalemate for a while. It's a back and forth. Neither side gains a decisive advantage until Titus Blackwood and Roose Bolton realize that while on the right side, because of how many cavalry there are, because of the reinforcements that Tyrion has sent, the longbowmen here under pressure are protected. The longbows under Sarsfield just have their wooden stakes to protect them. So what Titus Blackwood and Roose Bolton do, they send Great John Umber, Mage Mormont, and Jason Lannister straight against Sarsfield. Jason Lannister does then attack the Lannister pikes in the center from their left, while Great John Umber and Mage Mormont, with thousands of men from Last Heart and Bear Island, some of the heaviest infantry of the north, great swords, berserkers, etc., smash into the longbows of House Sarsfield. Lord Sarsfield tries to hold the line, but he is killed by Great John Umber. His retinue is kept occupied by Mage Mormont, and a gap is almost forced in the Lannister alliance, which Blackwood and Bolton will aim to exploit. Tyrion, faced with few other options and knowing that the lines are about to crumble, takes the 1,000 men that are left here in the rear guard of the Lannister force, takes 1,000 men and leads a cavalry charge against Great John Umber and Mage Mormont. He has few lancers, but he himself has a lance, and he takes Lady Mage in the chest, kills her, by luck really more than anything else, and manages to push back the Northmen. Great John Umber is forced by his men off the field, basically, or forced to retreat for a while. He rallies them, he attacks again, finds a position impenetrable, then he ends up helping Mallister attack the Lannister center from the left. And this goes on for about 6 hours or total. All of this takes place in about 6 hours. It's a bloody fight. Thousands of men end up dying on both sides, and neither side is able to win. Except after 6 hours of fighting, there is still one uncommitted force, and that's the force under Galbert Glover here in the Stark rearguard. But they've been ordered by Robb to only answer to him or Brynden Tully. So Titus Blackwood, after asking them for support, goes to Robb himself to beg him to order the rearguard of the Stark line or the Stark host to attack in the gap between the Lannister left and their center, to attack the line that's basically held by Tyrion right now, and that would possibly win them the battle, or to attack, or to march up here and support Mallister to take to continue pushing against the Lannister pikes from their left, because they've been doing that, but they can't fully commit because Tyrion is harassing them with his cavalry from where Sarsfield was positioned. Robb decides to order his men to attack the Imp, but before that order can be carried out, before Blackwood can reach Glover to carry out that order, Jaime appears with 1,200 horse. 300 of them are the clansmen Tyrion brought with him, and they've been leading 900 cavalry of both the First and the Second Westerlands army that Tywin's been secreting from the west bank to the east bank of the Green Fort. Basically, Tywin and Richard the Self-Insert is, they've known they can't really defeat the North for quite a while. They know the numbers are not stacked in their favor, and yes, they have a better equipped army, fairly solid formation, but they know it's too much, right? Their men have been in hostile territory. They're not particularly pleased with Tywin for the strict discipline they've been put under, so things are at the boiling point, really. Things are tense, could blow up in their faces. So they decide, okay, we're going to take a few men here and there over the few months we have, because the initial campaign takes about a month until the fighting dies down, right? Until Jaime takes Oldstone, Tywin camps at Harroway's Town. That takes about a month for most of the Riverlands to fall. It takes 3 further months for Robb Stark to actually march south. So in those 3 months, what they've been doing is moving a few men at a time east, including Jaime himself. The Second Westerlands army that's at Oldstones is left under Lord Banefort, And what Tywin's been able to do is get an elite cavalry unit. 3 cavalry banners, 900 men, 900 of the best riders in the entirety of the Westerlands, all on white horses with full plate, full barding as well. 900 heavy lancers descend from the mountains of the moon, having been led behind the Stark lines by the clansmen that Tyrion brought. The clansmen charge the Stark reserve, which attempts to intervene, but Jaime sends the clansmen to keep Galbart Glover occupied, which they do despite being outnumbered easily 10-1. There's about 300 clansmen, 40,000 in Stark reserve, but they keep it occupied long enough for Jaime to lead 900 men and 3 heavy cavalry banners directly against the Stark cavalry formation. At the same time, Sir Adam Marbrand and all his men make another attack. Robb tries to rally his men, but the Northern Horse is exhausted, is tired. They've been fighting all day. They've been bloodied by Sir Adam. Robb leads his men in a countercharge, and he is knocked on his ass. He is taken prisoner. Grey Wind barely survives, trying to defend him, and the Stark horse collapses. They are annihilated. Jaime then takes the mail fist, or the armored fist of the Lannister armies, and descends with thousands of horsemen, thousands of armored cavalry on the Stark center, and then they push the Stark right. The Northern army, the combined Northern and Riverlands host, is completely obliterated. The only reason most of them survive, despite the casualties that they've endured up to this point, the reason they survive is because Tywin gave orders to spare as many as possible. In most medieval battles, and most battles actually in history for quite a while, many casualties didn't happen during the actual fighting, but in the aftermath. You know, when one army broke and ran away and was chased down, that's when you saw a significant amount of casualties. That doesn't happen here. The Stark army is encircled, and they are forced to surrender. They could have been completely wiped out, but Tywin wants them alive, as many of them alive. The North loses most of its lord, most of their heirs, and is left effectively leaderless. Only about 400 men under Blackwood and Roose Bolton survived to make it to the Twins, where they engaged in their own bit of treachery. So, in the aftermath of this battle, there's 3,000 men from the Westerlands dead. There's 5,000 men from the North and the Riverlands dead. So 8,000 casualties, and it's probably the third biggest battle in the canon, or third biggest battle in the history of Song of Ice and Fire. I mean, the biggest would probably be the Trident, about close to 80,000 men. Second largest, the Field of Fire, 65,000. Here it's close to. Here it's a battle of close to 60,000 men, give or take. Obviously, that's not the perfect count, but still, it's a lot of men that are fighting on this battlefield, or close to 60,000, more like 55,000 really, if I'm being honest, 56,000 give or take. So it's the third largest battle according to the history we have of Song of Ice and Fire. 8,000 men are dead, which is a bloodbath. But when you look at history, when you're looking at historical accounts, so it's a bloodbath. And I wanted to reflect the fact that defeating Robb Stark with the army he had was not going to be an easy situation for Tywin Lannister. It was going to be a grinding war of attrition. That's going to be won because they have an advantage with the clansmen. That even in canon, the clansmen took a lot of people by surprise in the sense of how well they fought. Like Tywin expected them to break. He expected the vanguard to be slaughtered. That's why he placed them there, disposable troops. But they fought far better than that. Here, they are given fine steel, well equipped, and all they have to do is hold Galbart Glover while Jaime does all the things. Jaime wins a lot of glory for this, for the initial fighting, for the initial campaign, which has largely been fought by his army successfully. And he also as if it turns the tide of the battle here. The battle is won. Tyrion himself earns a fair share of glory, having killed Mage Mormont, having saved the Lannister lines from being overrun. And it's actually a point that I'm bringing up with regards to the cavalry. Tyrion did lead a cavalry charge at the Battle of Blackwater in the books. Like, you want to talk about Tyrion leading men at Blackwater? You want to talk about the show? Imagine Tyrion Lannister leading a wedge formation against Stannis' men on the Blackwater, effectively. That's what he did in the books. That's why the Battle of Blackwater is so great, really. It's very detailed. It's very grand and epic in the books. So he leads a cavalry charge of 1,000 men against the best forces in the north. Jaime leads 1,000 or close to 1,000 men, all on white armored horses. The white horses is a reference from the movie Waterloo. I was very impressed by the cavalry charge by the British cavalry, and Napoleon is saying those men on white horses are terrifying. Now, of course, they get defeated by the French. The British cavalry gets defeated by the French, despite how formidable and terrifying they are. But here, the 900 men that Jaime brings to him, heavily armored cavalry on white horses descending with a figure in golden plate leading them. It's like an image for the Northerners and Rivermen. It's like an image from The Long Night. That's how it is. It's horrifying, and obviously there's the psychological effect of that. So the Northern Army is defeated in a large part because of that. When Jaime arrives, it's a psychological impact. It's also the fact that everyone is basically exhausted at this point. So Jaime leading 900 of the finest men in all the armies that are assembled against the Starks breaks their lines, puts an end to them. The battle is won. At this point, the Second Westerlands Army from Oldstones marches to lay siege to takes Seaguard and marches from the west bank to lay siege to the Twins. A portion of the First Westerlands Army, Tywin's army, marches to lay siege from the east. So the Twins are under siege. There's about 1,200 men there. 400 under Lord Lionheart that Robb left in Cannon and here to basically hold the strategic choke point. 400 that Walder Frey kept as a garrison, and 400 that escaped to Titus Blackwood and Roose Bolton. But Titus Blackwood is still very fucking angry at Walder Frey for having basically abandoned him earlier on in the war at Oldstone. So instead of accepting guest rights, bread and salt, he slaughters the hell out of House Frey with Roose Bolton, while Lord Lionheart basically stands aside and lets it happen. So the Twins fall not because of the siege by the Westerlands armies, but by the actions of Lord Blackwood, who's earned the nickname by this point of the Black Raven for his initial actions in the campaign and the things he's also done in the battle, commanding the center with Roose Bolton. So Roose Bolton and Titus Blackwood present Walder Frey in chains and the rest of the members of House Frey in chains to Tywin Lannister, who slaughters the heck out of them. He leaves very few survivors, chiefly Stevron Frey and a few others, gives a few of the fair maidens, a few of the good women, women of good stock of House Frey to be married to men that might be interested in that as a sort of reward. Fair Walda, he makes a deal with Roose Bolton, marries Roose Bolton to Fair Walda. In exchange, Roose Bolton will deal with Ramsay Snow because he doesn't want a wild dog out of hand in the north, not at this particular time, while Rosalind Frey is given to Tyrion to marry. And Tywin explains this to Tyrion. She was a diamond in a pile of filth that was House Frey, and a diamond that Walder Frey himself protected because he wanted to basically because he understood the value she had. So he gives Tyrion a wife that he's wanted. He's wanted someone, a woman to love him, or a good wife ever since his first wife Tisha. And in a sense, you can read in this in various ways. Obviously, there's Richard influencing Tywin with respect to Tyrion because Richard knows the value Tyrion has, but there, of course, Tywin himself is fairly angry at all of his children for the things that they would do according to Richard, Cersei, Jaime, Tyrion himself. But basically, he's seeking to redeem. He's given both Jaime and Tyrion so far chances of redemption, so to speak. Tyrion commanding the rear guard, proving himself in the battle on the Green Fork. Jaime leading the Second Westerlands Army, winning glory for himself. And Titus, and importantly, Jaime is also the one that convinces Tywin to spare Lord Blackwood here. So with the Northerners, Tywin is willing to give them a pardon fairly easily, to forgive them, but not with the Rivermen, not with the River Lords, because because he did promise to hang them as bandits if they continued to resist after River Run fell. And Blackwood was the chief, was the man basically in charge of a good portion of River Lords that resist. But Jaime basically intervenes and uses Blackwood's valor, calls on his father to remember the valor with which Lord Blackwood fought, that Blackwood has proven his valor as a lord, and that he should be spared on account of that. Tywin agrees. Of course, this is deliberate. Tywin doesn't want to kill Lord Blackwood, who's earned the respect in the Riverlands and North, and really across the realm at this point. He doesn't want to kill him, but he doesn't want to look weak by going back on his word, so he allows Jaime to play the role of the person that persuades him to do it. Jaime does it, earns respect, makes himself look in a favorable light. Tywin is able to not appear weak, but also show mercy, and he does give one last chance for Lords Bracken, Darien, Motten, and Maidenpool to surrender. At the same time, they do, knowing exactly what will await them if they refuse, and the Riverlands and the North are both defeated in one big battle on the Green Fork. But Renly Baratheon soon declares himself king, which means the war will continue. But this is how Tywin Lannister defeats both the Riverlands and the North and forces Robb Stark to kneel before the Iron Throne. We'll see what happens in the next chapters. Obviously, there's still the political situation in King's Landing to deal with. There's still Joffrey, Cersei, etc. to deal with. And Kevin has been doing what he can, but obviously it hasn't been without its problems, suffice to say. So stay tuned for more. I just wanted to give some thoughts on what I was doing with this story, some input. It's been a bit longer than I assumed here, like 15, getting close to 15 minutes, over 14 minutes here with this video. So hope you all enjoyed this. The story is up on fanfiction.net and alternate history. Check it out, and do expect me to upload some new chapters. I'll try and do it every week or a bit longer than that. Depends though, because the story is going to grow in far more in complexity after this point. Dealing with the war in the Riverlands, dealing with the North, that's something that you can kind of do in a self-contained fashion, but now things are going to explode because I have to deal with the entirety of Westeros, so that's not necessarily going to be the easiest thing to handle. But stay tuned for more. I am committed to writing this, and I am very appreciative of the feedback I've gotten so far. Costin signing out. Thank you all for watching, and see you next time.